You picture yourself owning a medieval port, and you probably picture money rolling in the second a ship touches the quay. Not exactly. A port lord built the quay himself, dredged the channel by hand, paid to repair whatever the last storm had wrecked, and only then split whatever profits survived all of that with a king who had already decided how much of the trade belonged to him before a single ship arrived. Every sack of wool leaving England after 1275 handed the crown 6 shillings and 8 pence before the merchant carrying it saw a shilling of profit. Every foreign trader docking at the steel yard in London paid less tax than the Englishman standing next to him on the same quay. Every harbor on the south coast lived one bad storm away from becoming a sheep field. This is what it actually cost and what it actually paid to run a working medieval port. The tolls the crowns cut, the foreign merchants who somehow paid less than the locals, and the geography that could erase the entire business overnight. Owning a port didn't start with a purchase. It started with a charter, and a charter cost money before it earned any. A town wanting the right to collect its own tolls, hold its own court, and keep a share of royal customs had to petition the crown for that privilege, and then pay for it every single year through what was called a fee farm, a fixed annual sum owed to the king regardless of how good or bad trade actually turned out to be. Bristol, Southampton, and King's Lynn all operated under versions of this arrangement, effectively renting the right to tax themselves from the crown that technically still owned the ground. That fee farm did not move. A bad harvest inland, a slow trading season, a war that closed the channel to shipping. None of it lowered the bill. The lord or the corporation running the port owed the crown the same fixed sum whether 10 ships came in that year or 100. Profit only began after that fixed cost was covered, which meant the actual business of running a port started with a number that had nothing to do with trade at all and everything to do with a deal struck with the crown long before the first ship arrived. A wealthy inland baron in 1300 might clear 200 to 500 pounds a year from his estates. A port town's fee farm ran as a standing charge against income the town hadn't earned yet, a debt owed on the promise of trade, not the proceeds of it. The crown also reserved a few sources of income no charter could sign away. Prisage, the king's ancient right over wine, let him take 1 ton from any English ship carrying 10 to 20 tons, and 2 tons from anything larger, at a price fixed well below market value. Foreign merchants secured an exemption from this in 1302, in exchange for a flat duty of 2 shillings a ton called butlerage instead. This meant the crown taxed its own subjects wine in kind, taxed foreign merchants wine in coin, and collected both regardless of what any port's own charter said. A port lord could negotiate the fee farm, appeal a bad harvest year, and lobby for new privileges. He could not negotiate prisage. Once the fixed cost to the crown was covered, the port made its own money in small, constant amounts, charged at nearly every stage a ship touched land. Anchorage was the fee for the right to drop anchor in the harbor at all. Quayage came next, charged for the use of the dock itself. Craneage covered the labor of lifting heavy cargo off the ship with a crane, useful for anything too bulky for a man to carry. Pessage, sometimes recorded as tronage, was the fee for weighing goods once they reached shore, since duty owed to the crown was calculated by weight and had to be verified locally before it could be collected. Porterage paid the men who physically carried cargo from the water's edge to the merchant storehouses. None of these fees were large individually. A halfpenny here, a penny there, repeated across dozens of ships a month rather than extracted in bulk from a single one. Some ports layered in keelage too, a due charged on the vessel itself for the harbor space it occupied while loading or unloading. A boatload of goods entering Shrewsbury in 1220 was charged 4 pence under the town's muirage grant, a cart a single penny, a horse load a quarter penny, rates trivial on their own and substantial once multiplied across a working trading season. Towns stacked these tolls deliberately because no single one generated enough revenue to matter alone. The port's real income came from repetition. The same small charge, collected on the same categories of goods, thousands of times a year, rather than one large payment collected occasionally. Before any of those local tolls mattered, the king had already taken his share, and he had built an entire bureaucracy to make sure of it. In 1275, Edward I established what became known as the Great and Ancient Custom, a duty of 6 shillings and 8 pence on every sack of wool exported from England, with additional charges levied on wool fells and hides. Foreign merchants later paid an extra rate on top of that under what was called the New Custom, a prize for the royal protection they received while trading on English soil. 2 collectors of customs and a controller were appointed at every designated port to administer it, and payment was certified with a 2-part seal called a cocket, one half held by the collectors, the other kept by the merchant, so that neither side could later forge proof that a duty had been paid when it hadn't. English wool exports peaked at somewhere between 35,000 and 45,000 sacks a year in the early 1300s, driven by demand from cloth weaving centers in Flanders and Italy that considered English long wool unmatched for quality. At 6 shillings 8 pence a sack, that single export duty alone generated a scale of royal revenue no port lord could touch, undercut, or negotiate around, no matter how favorable his own local tolls were. The system was also, predictably, worth cheating. A single 14th century investigation uncovered roughly 2,500 sacks of wool smuggled out in one fleet bound for Dordrecht, evidence that the crown's cut was steep enough to make outright evasion worth the risk for merchants willing to bribe an official or land quietly on an unguarded stretch of coast. The port collected its own tolls only after the king had already been paid or had already been robbed of what he was owed. London's trade was large enough that it needed 3 entirely separate sets of customs accounts running at once. One for the wool custom and its subsidy, one for the so-called petty customs on smaller goods, and one for tonnage and poundage, a duty charged on wine by the ton and on general merchandise by value. Smaller ports like Boston, Hull, and Ipswich managed with a single consolidated account by the early 1400s. London never did, because no other English port moved enough cargo to justify separating its bookkeeping 3 ways in the first place. Not every port paid the crown at all. Some paid with ships instead. Along England's southeast coast, 5 towns, Dover, Sandwich, Hythe, New Romney, and Hastings, later joined by the ancient towns of Rye and Winchelsea, struck a fundamentally different arrangement with the crown. In exchange for supplying a fixed quota of ships and crews for royal service a set number of days each year, the Cinque Ports received exemption from custom, toll, lastage, passage, rivage, and a long list of other national taxes, along with the right to hold their own courts, free from the jurisdiction of any outside sheriff. Charters confirmed in 1260 and 1278 formalized the arrangement, and the ports were additionally granted the right to run the International Herring Fair on Yarmouth Strand and the ceremonial honor of bearing the royal canopy at every coronation. The crown got a functioning navy without the cost of building or permanently maintaining one. Shipbuilding, crew wages, and constant upkeep all sat with the towns themselves, not the royal treasury. The portsmen, in return, got tax-free trade across the entire kingdom, jurisdiction over their own criminal and civil cases, and a legal right to keep goods salvaged from any wreck that washed up along their shore. During the 1346 siege of Calais, Hastings alone supplied 5 vessels and 96 men to the royal fleet, its contribution to a campaign that stretched on for a full year. For both sides, this was for a long stretch of the medieval period a genuinely good trade, right up until the geography underneath it changed. That the cost this video comes back to later, because it eventually mattered more than any tax exemption ever had. Foreign traders arriving at an English port might reasonably be expected to pay more than local merchants trading the exact same goods. At the Steelyard in London, the opposite was true. If you're finding this kind of number-by-number breakdown useful, hit subscribe. This channel does one of these every week. Anyway, the Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant cities running from Cologne to Danzig, negotiated a set of privileges with successive English kings that put its own merchants ahead of the merchants living in the very city they were trading in. From 1347, an English merchant exporting a bolt of undyed cloth paid 1 shilling 2 pence in duty. A foreign merchant outside the league paid 2 shillings 9 pence for the same bolt. A Hanseatic merchant, under his league's negotiated rate, paid just 1 shilling. The League operated its own walled compound on the Thames called the Steelyard, complete with warehouses, a chapel, a weigh house, its own living quarters, and an elected alderman governing the community inside. By 1500, Hanseatic merchants were handling roughly a quarter of all English cloth exports passing through the Port of London. King's Lynn hosted a second Hanseatic base, its warehouse still standing today as the only one of its kind left in England, trading fish, timber, pitch, and iron shipped in from Danzig and Hamburg in exchange for English wool, cloth, lead, and beer. Successive English kings, Edward I, Edward II, and Edward III among them, had borrowed heavily from Hanseatic merchants and repaid the debt in trading privileges rather than coin, which meant a port lord's own citizens were routinely undercut on their own quay by foreign merchants operating under a better deal than any Englishman could get. The resentment this built eventually turned into open conflict. English merchants, unable to compete on price against a rival paying half the duty, pushed the crown into the Anglo-Hanseatic War of 1469 to 1474, fought largely over control of the wool and cloth trade to the Baltic. The League's privileges survived that war and lasted for well over a century afterward, revoked and partially restored more than once, before Elizabeth I permanently closed the Steelyard in 1598 and ordered its remaining merchants out of the country, a decision 300 years in the making. Ever since the first English king decided it was cheaper to borrow from foreign merchants than to tax his own. England's single most valuable export wasn't allowed to leave through just any port the crown happened to license. From 1363, every sack of wool bound for the continent had to pass through one designated town, Calais, held by England since its capture in 1347, and now turned into what was called the Staple. Before Calais, the Staple location had moved repeatedly for political reasons, sitting at Dordrecht in 1338 and Bruges in 1343. A fixed group of 26 merchants was incorporated as the Company of the Staple at Calais, given a total, enforceable monopoly on wool exports in exchange for helping fund the town's defense and collecting the crown's duties on the crown's behalf. Under the 1354 Statute of the Staple, a separate list of designated English staple towns existed too: Bristol, Canterbury, Chichester, Exeter, Lincoln, London, Newcastle, Norwich, Winchester, and York among them. None of that changed the basic fact that the final export step for wool ran through Calais alone. For a port outside that arrangement, this was a direct and permanent loss of business. Trade that might otherwise have passed naturally through a well-placed English harbor was instead funneled across the channel to a single fortified town, run by a fixed membership answering to the crown rather than to any port lord. The staplers became so central to royal finance that by the 15th century they were lending money directly to the king in exchange for tax-free export licenses and royal pardons. This meant the merchants controlling one port's monopoly were, in effect, financing the very government that set every other port's rules. None of the income described so far mattered if the harbor itself stopped functioning, and a harbor did not maintain itself. Towns paid for their own physical infrastructure through a specific family of local levies. Murage funded the construction and repair of town walls. Pavage paved streets and market squares. Pontage maintained bridges. Quayage went directly toward building or repairing the dock itself. Gloucester's murage grants through the 1320s and 1330s charged goods entering the town by both land and water at rates specific to each commodity. A quarter penny per horse load of corn or malt, a halfpenny per 100 cheap furs, 6 pence per 100 of the finer greywork furs. These were not one-time construction costs. Silt built up in every tidal channel. Timber quays rotted within a few decades, and stone walls needed constant patching against weather and neglect. So the same tolls that had paid for the original harbor kept being renewed, grant after grant, decade after decade, simply to hold the port at the depth ships actually needed to reach it. A port lord who let these levies lapse, or who spent the money collected under them on something else, was borrowing against the harbor's future usability. The bill came due the first time a fully loaded ship couldn't get close enough to the quay to unload its cargo, and by then it was the town's entire trading income at risk, not just the maintenance fund. A port's most unusual source of income came from the ships that never made it in safely at all. Right of wreck gave the port lord legal claim to goods washed ashore from a wrecked vessel, cargo thrown overboard by a crew trying to save a sinking ship, and anything left floating unclaimed after a set period, typically a year and a day. The sink ports held this right explicitly as one of their named charter privileges, alongside the authority to punish those who shed blood within their jurisdiction and to detain criminals fleeing justice from elsewhere. It turned disaster into a genuine revenue line. A wrecked wine ship out of Bordeaux or a grounded wool carrier bound for Flanders could hand the port lord an entire cargo's value without a single toll ever being charged, simply because the goods now legally belong to whoever's shore they happen to land on. The same coastline that generated this windfall also generated the constant threat that made it worth having. Piracy along the channel was common enough that merchants and port authorities both budgeted for the loss, and the sink port's fleet built and maintained for royal service doubled, when it suited the towns, as the source of exactly the kind of raiding it was officially meant to prevent. A port lord's relationship with the sea combined extraction, defense, and salvage into a single running operation, off the same short stretch of water, with no clean line separating legitimate toll income from opportunistic plunder. Running a genuinely working harbor eventually meant putting money into the ships themselves, on top of the dock they tied up at. The standard cargo vessel of the period was the cog, a single-masted, square-rigged ship with clinker-built sides and a flat, flush-planked bottom that let it settle level in a harbor at low tide instead of tipping onto its side. Seagoing cogs typically ran 15 to 25 meters long, 5 to 8 meters wide, carried 30 to 200 tons burthen, and were built almost entirely from oak. A skilled carpenter earned roughly 3 pence a day in the mid-14th century, a skilled mason around 4 pence, and a loaded cog required a paid crew across weeks or months at sea rather than a single day's labor at a fixed site. None of that spinning happened once and then stopped. Hulls needed recalking, rigging needed regular replacing, and a ship lost to a channel storm or a pirate raid represented a loss measured not just in the vessel's price, but in every wage, timber load, and month it had taken to build in the first place. A port that wanted reliable trade rather than occasional, opportunistic trade had to either own ships outright or guarantee berth safe and well-maintained enough that independent ship owners chose that harbor over a rival one further down the coast. Either path meant real capital tied up in wood, rope, and wages long before a single sack of wool ever generated a shilling of toll income for the town collecting it. Scale that against ordinary income, and the commitment becomes clearer. An unskilled laborer around 1,300 might earn up to £2 in an entire year. A single cog's crew, paid across a multi-week voyage plus the weeks spent loading, unloading, and waiting on tide and weather, could easily represent several years of an ordinary laborer's total income before the ship had carried a single profitable cargo. Owning the dock was one business. Owning, or reliably attracting, the ships that used it was an entirely separate and considerably more expensive one. Every calculation made so far in this video assumed the harbor would still be there next year. That single assumption killed more medieval ports than any war ever did. On a single night in February 1287, a storm redrew the entire southeast coast of England. New Romney, a thriving sink port with the River Rother running directly through its harbor, was buried under shingle, mud, and soil that raised the town's ground level by roughly 5 inches and pushed the coastline nearly a mile away from where it had stood the previous morning. The Rother found an entirely new outlet to the sea 15 miles off, at Rye. Of course, the river still follows today, and New Romney's working life as a port ended in the space of a single storm, despite a canal called the Ree Wall having been built decades earlier specifically to keep its channel clear. Old Winchelsea was destroyed outright in the same storm and rebuilt several miles inland on higher ground, on a grid layout that made it one of the first planned towns in England. Dunwich, further up the east coast, lost land to the sea more gradually, over decades rather than a single night, until most of what had been a prosperous trading town simply no longer existed. A charter, a fee farm, a full schedule of tolls, and a fleet of well-maintained cogs were all worthless the moment the water stopped reaching the quay. The most successful medieval port lords were rarely the ones who had collected the most tolls in any single good year. They were the ones whose harbor was still a harbor 20 years later, and geography, not management and not royal favor, decided most of that outcome long before any lord had a say in it. A port only worked as a business because someone owned the land it sat on, and that same underlying model of ownership ran across the rest of medieval England, just in a completely different shape. An estate didn't depend on tides, storms, or a channel staying clear. But it came with its own hidden arithmetic. Manorial courts that generated fee income every time a tenant broke a rule, rents that stayed legally fixed for an entire lifetime, while the cost of actually running the land kept climbing underneath them, and a domain that had to be farmed directly, leased out, or gambled on, depending entirely on which option a lord could actually afford in any given year. The next video breaks down exactly what it cost to hold a medieval estate, and exactly what it paid once the rents came in and the obligations that came with owning people, as well as land, finally came due.